Hello everyone. In continuation with the venous sinuses, today's topic is on unpaired venous sinuses. First of all, the superior sagittal sinus. Superior sagittal sinus, where it is located, from where it get the blood, and where it terminates. Three are the main things to remember related to the venous sinuses. First of all, it is it lies within the attached margins of the fox cerebri. Fox cerebri is a sickle shaped dural fold lies at the mid midline or the mid sagittal section, and this is the attached convex margin of the fox cerebri. It starts from the foramina cecum and it terminates into the generally into the right transverse sinus near the internal occipital protuberance. So this is the superior sagittal sinus. Now, second thing, majority of times the superior sagittal sinus terminates towards the right and drain into the right transverse sinus, but it may terminate into the left transverse sinus. Now, third important point is relate which is related to the superior sagittal sinus is a term that is the confluence of sinuses, or it is also termed as torcular hierophyllae. What it is the dilated posterior end of the superior sagittal sinus. It is somewhat here. This is the dilated posterior end of the superior sagittal sinus. As we go backwards, or as the superior sagittal sinus moves from anterior to posterior, the size of the sinus gradually increases, and the posterior dilated part is termed as the confluence of the sinuses, that is the torcular hierophyllae, and it lodges in the depression usually on the right side of the internal occipital protuberance, and the right transverse sinus begins with the confluence of the sinuses. And a communicating vein that connects between the left and right transverse sinuses is connecting the confluences with confluence with the left transverse sinus. Now, from where superior sagittal sinus drains the blood, in cerebrum we have three surfaces: inferior surface, lateral surface, that is the superior lateral surface, and medial surface. The position of the fox cerebri is in between the two cerebral hemispheres. So superior sagittal sinus drains blood from the superior lateral surface of the cerebrum and medial surface of the cerebrum. These veins come these veins come and they drain within the superior sagittal sinus, and they run obliquely. Blood flows in the superior sagittal sinus from anterior to posterior, and these veins drain their blood in the opposite direction of the flow of the blood to prevent the collapse or the closure of the opening. So these veins are obliquely placed. So these veins are also termed as the superior cerebral vein. These are 8 to 12 in number, and they collect blood from the superior lateral side and the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. And their direction is they are obliquely forward and upward. these are obliquely forward and upward to prevent the collapse of the mouths of the cerebral veins during the increased intracranial pressure. Second tributary of the superior sagittal sinus are the diploic veins, emissary veins through the venous lacunae. One more important thing related to the superior sagittal sinus is the venous lacunae. Lacunae are the irregular venous spaces intervening in between the two layers of the cranial dura, and these are three in number, that is frontal, parietal and occipital, and these lacunae collect the blood from the diploic meningeal veins and they further drain into the superior sagittal sinus. So this is the position of the superior sagittal sinus. This is superior sagittal sinus, and this is the confluence of sinus, and these small openings, these openings are openings of the superior cerebral veins which drains blood from the superior lateral surface and the medial surface. Now communications of the superior sagittal sinus. Superior sagittal sinus communicate with the veins of the scalp through the parietal emissary veins, occasionally through the nose. If the foramina cecum is patent, then it may lead to the problem of the nose bleeding, that is termed as epistaxis, and with the cavernous sinus through the superior anastomotic vein of Trollard. And these names, the inferior sagittal sinus. This is the inferior sagittal sinus. It lies within the posterior two-third. See, this is the anterior one-third and this is the posterior two-third. So it lies within the posterior two-third of the free margin of the falx cerebri. This is falx cerebri and it lies within the posterior two-third of the free margin of the falx cerebri. It collects blood from the falx cerebri and medial surface of the cerebrum, because in the posterior end it is somewhat near the corpus callosum, white fibers of the cerebrum, and it collects blood from the medial surface and from the falx cerebri, and it terminates into the straight sinus. This is the straight sinus. It terminates into the straight sinus. Now next unpaired sinus is straight sinus. So this is the straight sinus. Inferior sagittal sinus terminates into the straight sinus. It is situated between the junction of the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebri. If we understand inverted T, so this is the falx cerebri and this horizontal portion is made by the tentorium cerebri. It is a tent like partition between the cranial cavity. So it is somewhat horizontally placed, and the falx cerebri is somewhat placed in the midline. So straight sinus is situated within the junction of the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebri. This is the area of the junction of the two cerebri. This is the This one is the fox cerebri, and here is a horizontal partition, that is the tentorium cerebri, and it lies, straight sinus lies within the two cerebri. As we see in this diagram, this is the fox cerebri, this portion dark colored is the fox cerebri whole, and this one is the tentorium cerebri. This horizontal partition is tentorium cerebri, and the inferior sagittal sinus is going to drain into the straight sinus. Straight sinus begins as a continuation of the inferior sagittal sinus, passes backward, downward, and terminates into the left transverse sinus. In majority of the cases, it terminates into the left transverse sinus, because right transverse sinus is formed after the confluence of sinus, and confluence of the sinuses is the dilated end of the superior sagittal sinus. Now tributaries of the straight sinus get inferior sagittal sinus, a superior cerebellar vein, because below the tentorium we have cerebellum, above the tentorium we have cerebrum. So some cerebellar veins, superior cerebellar veins, which is come out from the U-shaped notch, that is termed as the tentorial notch of the this tentorium cerebelli, and in this notch there is the part of the midbrain and some part of the upper portion, that is the vermis of the cerebellum. So tributaries of the straight sinus is inferior sagittal sinus, superior cerebellar veins, and great cerebral vein of the galen. This is the important point, that it great cerebral vein of galen. It is formed by the union of the two internal cerebral veins, and it is guarded by a small body of arachnoid granulation tissue that act as a ball valve to regulate the formation of the CSF by the lateral and the third ventricles. Arachnoid granulations are the specifications of the superior sagittal sinus. Now another unpaired sinus is the occipital sinus. It is the smallest sinus and it is situated along the attached margins of the fox cerebri. Somewhat, if we see, here below the tentorium we have now occipital sinus. Occipital sinus is the smallest sinus. This is the occipital sinus. If we see in this diagram, this is the occipital sinus. It is the smallest sinus. It is situated along the attached margins of the fox cerebelli. It is in the fox cerebelli. It begins as a small radical near the margin of the foramina magnum. From here it starts from below and it moves, it drains upward. It terminates in the confluence of the sinuses. This is the confluence of the sinus, which is the dilated part of the superior sagittal sinus. Next, unpaired sinuses are the anterior and the posterior intercavernous sinus. These are the cavernous sinus. Cavernous sinus are the paired sinuses. This is the anterior and this is the posterior, this one portion. posterior, anterior and posterior intercavernous sinus. These are also termed as the circular sinus because they form a circle around the sella turcica. And the basilar venous plexus, these venous plexus are termed as the basilar venous plexus, and it is a network, it is basically a plexiform venous network that lies on the clivus of the skull, and these communicates below through the foramina magnum with the internal vertebral venous plexus. These are basilar venous plexus connected with the vertebral venous plexus. So these are seven unpaired venous sinuses.